The Negro is free whether we like it or not. For the purity and progress of both races, they must accept their place in the lower order of things. That place is the cotton fields of the South. Such is the rule of the plantation and the law of God. Governor Benjamin Humphreys.
But blacks did not see themselves trapped in the cotton fields. They used their vote to elect black representatives, sat on juries, and sent their children to school.
What had alarmed the white South during Reconstruction was not evidence of black failure, but evidence of black success, evidence of black assertion, evidence of black independence, evidence of black advancement, and evidence that black men were learning the uses of political power.
If intimidation would not keep blacks in their place, then violence might. In the same year that Reconstruction began, Nathan Bedford Forrest, a Confederate general, founded the Ku Klux Klan. The image of the Klan in white hoods killing blacks by the light of burning crosses would forever be etched in the American mind.
The way white supremacists made sure that ex-slaves would fall back into place or nearly back into place was terror. Beating people up, burning down their houses, shooting them, just the usual physical mayhem of personal violence.
Although they were beaten into submission and retreat, 1869 offered a glimmer of hope with the election of Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant to the presidency, and Grant delivered. He sent federal troops to the South to counter groups like the Klan. But for the black community, even federal intervention was not enough.
The question of, should we stay at home in the South? Should we stay at home in the United States? Should we move somewhere else to the north? Should we move to the west? Or should we leave the United States entirely?
Feeling trapped and helpless and in need of answers, some turned to an unlikely source, an old man who had been born in slavery.
We needed land for our children. That caused my heart to grieve in sorrow. Pity for my race caused me to work for them. Confidence has perished and faded away. We are going to leave the South. Pap Singleton.
In 1874, Pap Singleton, a former slave, would lead a group of 300 blacks to Kansas. John Brown struck his first blow against slavery there. God must be in Kansas, and black people wanted to go where God was. No one spoke this call stronger than Sojourner Truth.
I have prayed so long that my people would go to Kansas, and that God would make straight the way before them. This colored people is going to be a people. Do you think God has them robbed and scourged all the days of their life for nothing?
Many of the people saw their promised land, they saw their Jordan River being those places that they had to cross over into, where freedom would be away from those who had basically had their feet on their necks all this time, just like the Pharaoh had done in the Bible. So many of them followed their leaders so that they could have their life to themselves, however they wanted that to be built.
They also believed in the God of Daniel, who was an avenging God. This is the God of the apocalypse, the God of the second coming, the God of the decision of who was going to go to heaven and who was going to go to hell.
But as much as Kansas loomed as a promised land for many blacks, getting there could become a journey through hell. Many would perish from starvation and exposure. One group fell victim to yellow fever, and there was always the fear of murderous flights.
I saw colored men and women cast themselves to the ground in despair, heard them groan and shout their lamentations. What is to become of these wretched people, God only knows. Here were nearly 1,000, scattered along the banks of the mighty Mississippi, without shelter, without food, with no hope of escaping from their present surrounding, and hardly a chance of returning from whence they came. Riverboat Captain.
For those who survived to make it to Kansas, they found a land of hard winters, torrential rains, and violent tornadoes. But through spiritual and emotional conviction, they sustained themselves, and within a few years, over 20 towns would be built. But not all blacks thought the answer was to leave the South. Frederick Douglass, a former slave who had become the leading black voice for abolition, opposed any mass exodus.
The country will be told of the hundreds who go to Kansas, but not of the thousands who stay in Mississippi. They will be told of the destitute who require material aid, but not of the multitude who are bravely sustaining themselves where they are. If the people of this country cannot be protected in every state of the Union, the sovereignty of the nation is an empty one, and the power in individual states is greater than the power of the United States. Frederick Douglass.
In 1877, Republican President Rutherford B. Hayes, who had won the election by making a deal for electoral votes from Southern Democrats, pulled federal troops from the South. The party of Lincoln had betrayed the former slaves. Reconstruction was over. Whites began to reassert their power over blacks, politically, legally, and economically. And nowhere was this change more crushing than for those blacks who were farmers, most of whom were sharecroppers.
Owners controlled their little worlds. So there was no police power, there was no federal power, there was no state power that actually made a difference on the ground. So you had relations of dependency built around obedience and submission. That was the ideology of the culture of slavery, obedience and submission.
Here was the black man, having very limited education, not knowing how to figure and to read, with the books being kept by the white man who is giving him his supplies to start a crop, and likewise owned the land. When the black man ended up at the end of the year and brought his crop in, the white man immediately arranged to outfigure him.
The man would take your cotton, and then the man at the store you had credit, he run the books up on you, so you didn't have nothing. You work a whole year and hand pick 40 bales of cotton and come out with nothing.
Frustrated by the unfulfilled promise of emancipation, blacks turned to the next generation, to their children. They believed education would be the key to overcome white dominance. One man would come to symbolize this hope, Booker T. Washington. Born into slavery, Washington had managed to learn to read and write, and at 9 he worked in a salt mine. But within 25 years, Washington had been a student and a teacher at the Hampton Institute, and was invited to be principal of a new school in Alabama. That school was Tuskegee. Arriving in a community of farms and sharecroppers, where attending school was rare if at all, Washington faced a great challenge: to build a school, attract students, recruit teachers. On July 4th, 1881, in the Zion Hill Baptist Church, the Tuskegee Institute was born. Washington and his 30 recruits believed the only way to one day have their own buildings would be to build them themselves.
The reason that it started as an industrial school was because they had nothing, and so they had to build, grow, and make everything, like harness making, because they needed to have harnesses for the farm animals. Carpentry, because they needed to build the buildings. Brick masonry, because they needed to make the bricks. These kinds of trades, printing, shoemaking, tailoring, carpentry, all of these things were things that they could use to build a business.
One student who found opportunity